biophilia to ergonomics. And the amount of people that are showing up has grown so much over the last few months that we have gone to 2 events per month. They're located on our website at chaseoffice.ca. And anybody who joins one of our webinars will be invited to the upcoming webinars as well. And we always take feedback. If there's topics that you would like us to bring to you, please feel free to let us know. We have got probably 30 or 40 pending topics coming over the next 12 months. We've got some fantastic speakers, including internationally renowned master feng shui speakers, to someone like Richard out of Europe, to local people, ergonomics. The topics are a wide range. You can leave yourself on mute. If you have a question, you can write the question in the question box. We'll get to them at the end. Or Richard, I'm sure will have some points during the presentation where he engages everybody and asks questions. Richard has a major in psychology with a minor in sound technology at Rhodes University in South Africa. He worked as an acoustic consultant for 7 years with a focus on improving acoustics in a variety of corporate and office settings before joining Budsey Space more than a year ago. He's an accredited speaker for both CEU and CPD programs, helping designers, architects, and facility managers gain knowledge about the importance of acoustics at the start of each project. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Richard for the presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for that introduction, Nolan. Right. I do want to share my screen. I'm just going to make sure I share the right one. Share computer screen. Okay, there we go. All right. So I take it you guys can all see the slide in front of you.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so just before we get started, this is a CEU accredited event. So if you guys didn't register prior to the event, you can use your mobile device right now. So that link in red over there, that is the link to this particular class. So what I would actually suggest is just taking that down. It takes about 10 or 20 seconds to register. It is very important that you do so. In order to receive your credit for having attended the webinar, you do need to go online and register. So I'd advise either you do that now or you do it at the end of the session. I'll just give you guys another reminder before we sign off then. And the class code is 5B6P. Right, so as Nolan said, today's topic is obviously acoustics. We're going to be looking at the impact that acoustics has on creating a happier and a healthier workspace. We've broken everything up into 5 categories. We think these are the important things that we need to convey to you guys. We're going to start off with why acoustics matter. So what is the impact of sound on our day-to-day lives? What is the inherent value behind having good acoustics? Then we're going to look at what is sound. How exactly do we measure it? What is the science that goes into it? And then we're going to look at reverberation. So that is the primary metric that we are measuring and we're trying to improve in terms of reducing noise levels and giving people a much more comfortable environment to work in. Then section 4, room treatment. So we'll take all of the theory and look at how do we actually apply that in a given space. How do you balance the acoustics in the room? And then the last section is for tips and tricks. If you guys have any questions, you're welcome to post them in the chat section, or I think Zoom does have the facility where you're actually able to raise your hand. So if you do that, I can obviously take a quick pause and answer your guys' question. This presentation is meant to be about an hour in duration. I say meant to be because unfortunately sometimes I do end up running over by about 5 or 10 minutes. If I do so, please do just stick with us. There's quite a bit of important information that we need to convey, and I hope that you do find the session to be interesting and informative. All right, so if we have a start and we look at things, why does acoustics matter? Let's look first at the definition, because that's always a very good starting point. Now, we define acoustics as the properties or the qualities of a room or a building that determine how sound is transmitted in it. So when you consider that definition, you realize that acoustics isn't so much about sound. It's actually much more about architecture. It is about the types of materials that we use in a room. What is the floor made out of, the walls and the ceiling? What type of objects do you have in that room? And how is the acoustic properties of those surfaces actually affecting the way in which sound is reacting in that given space? A lot of people like to ask, is this acoustic? Is that acoustic? Technically, every single physical object is acoustic. It has acoustic properties. The more hard and dense a material is, the more it will reflect sound waves. The more soft and porous a material is, the better it will absorb sound waves. So most importantly, though, the discussion about acoustics is actually really a discussion about productivity and well-being. So a lot of the time when we're talking about acoustics, it very quickly becomes the technical discussion. People start talking about different materials, different solutions, where do you place them, how many do you need? But a lot of the time we really glance over the inherent value proposition behind acoustics. Why is it important? And as I said before, it's actually a discussion about people's well-being, and it's a discussion about productivity. That's why the title of this presentation is Happier and Healthier Workspaces. So I think when we consider it also in the framework of other environmental factors that have an impact on our day-to-day experience, you could really consider acoustics along with air and light as the three driving factors that help create a happy and a healthy work environment. So there's been lots of studies. People are very well informed and understand the importance of having good lighting in terms of keeping people alert and awake, and obviously giving them enough illumination on their tabletop. And we're also familiar with the importance of having good air, why we need good ventilation in a building. So we've really addressed those two environmental factors in air and light. It's only really over the past 2 decades that acoustics has been starting to receive the same attention as another one of those environmental aspects that we really need to consider, and we need to try and control and dampen in a space, really just to give people that physical environment that is ideal for their well-being and their productivity. Now, we often like to say sound never sleeps, and that is absolutely true. When you think about it, it's really ubiquitous and pervasive. It's constantly around us, and it's really deeply embedded in our experience, both socially when we talk to each other, and our experience in terms of our given environment. A lot of people don't realize you are actually able to hear before you are even born. So about 18 weeks into the pregnancy, the fetus is actually able to hear. And the first 2 things you hear is the sound of the mother's heartbeat and the sound of the movement of water, which actually makes a lot of sense when we think about the positive effect that the sound of water in motion has when we think about a stream or the ocean, or even rain itself falling. So we really have to consider all of these things. And earlier we were chatting about biophilia and the importance that having nature-inspired elements has on your general well-being and your sense of satisfaction. And I'll really tie that into our acoustic heritage. So when we talk about acoustic heritage, we're talking about the types of soundscapes that we were previously exposed to prior to the Industrial Revolution. So if we look at human history, 100 years or 1,000 years ago, our ancestors were living in a completely different environment. They were actually outside in nature. And when you think about that, when you're outdoors, the types of sounds that you're exposed to are entirely different. When you're outdoors, you have the sound of the rain, moving water, the sound of the wind through the trees and leaves, the sounds of birds and other animals. Even though all those things are going on subconsciously below our awareness, they are having a direct effect in terms of how connected we feel with our environment and with nature itself. Unfortunately now, post the Industrial Revolution, the majority of us are working indoors. We spend the majority of our time indoors, and that's really resulted in quite a big disconnect from nature and our natural, normal environment. The types of sounds that we're exposed to indoors are entirely different. You've got a lot of people in a confined space. There's lots of conversation going on. There's keyboards typing, there's phones ringing, there's the sound of printers, air conditioning, and all of those things are really actually having a very subtle effect on our minds in terms of our day-to-day experience. Now, a lot of people like to say they can multitask. It's been scientifically proven you cannot multitask. When you think you are multitasking, all you are doing is actually switching between different tasks in very quick and rapid succession. If you're able to do that very efficiently, it can feel like you're multitasking, but you're not really. And what a lot of people don't realize is you actually are operating at reduced efficiency. And the reason being is the moment you switch from one task to another, it takes your brain a couple of seconds to refocus on what it is that you're working on the task at hand. And that process of having to continually refocus and refocus, you're actually reducing your productivity by limiting your efficiency. Now, a lot of this presentation is all going to be about acoustics in a corporate setting or a commercial setting in the office space. We did think we would include this slide just as an interesting tidbit. A lot of people don't realize that sound and noise can have an impact on the way in which you perceive food and the way in which you perceive the flavor of different types of food. So if you are in a very noisy environment, that'll have an impact on the degree to which you are able to taste bitter, sweet, and salty flavors. So really a well acoustically treated restaurant that has a very low ambient noise level does make for a very improved dining experience. It actually makes the food taste substantially better. Another interesting thing, I know a lot of people will always complain about the type of food that you get served on an airplane. Interestingly enough, the culinary chefs or the people that design the menus for planes, they are actually cognizant and aware of this. So they realize that when you're on the plane, you're exposed to a large amount of noise, not just during the takeoff and the landing, but throughout the entire duration of the flight. You are constantly being bombarded by vibrational energy, even though your ears might not necessarily pick up on all of that. And they actually cater the type of food they serve you with that in mind, to try and ensure that they give you types of foods with the type of flavor palette that really is going to give you the best culinary experience. Despite that, I think a lot of people would still feel there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of the quality of the food. Now, we had originally lots of facts and figures and survey information. We decided to reduce this section of the presentation. We didn't want it to be too boring, but we have kept a couple of very important facts and figures. This, for me, is the most important one. Employees can be up to 66% less productive when exposed to just one nearby conversation. Now, there's a very important distinction that needs to be made at this point, and that is the distinction between conversational distractions and background noise. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, our brains are hardwired to pay attention to human speech. It is how we have advanced as a species. It is what civilization has been built upon, is language, our ability to communicate with each other, which has allowed us to actually collaborate, and that is what has resulted in the civilization that we all enjoy today. So when you are in an office space, or for a matter of fact, when you are in any kind of context and you are trying to complete a certain task, or your focus is on a particular activity and there's a conversation going on in the background, your brain is automatically wanting to latch onto that conversation as important and relevant information. So the moment you are able to make out the words and the sentences of what is being said, your brain is constantly grasping at that conversation. You inherently want to eavesdrop, just in case there might be some relevant information. So while you are sat there engaged in whatever cognitive task you might be, it could be typing an email, it could be reading an email, it could be an analytical task in which you need to do some calculations. You're sat there and you are projecting your focus on that particular task at hand. And that conversation that's going on in the background, it is actually using a continuous and constant amount of your cognitive resources to block out that conversation as irrelevant. So even though you might not be paying attention, you are operating at reduced efficiency, you are less productive, and you are much more prone to making errors and mistakes purely because you have that conversational distraction. Now, this has become much more of a pronounced issue ever since we moved to an open plan office setting. Obviously, there's lots of benefits that come from an open plan. It fosters greater collaboration. It's a slightly more intimate setting where you are more closely positioned to your colleagues. And obviously, it's much more space efficient in that you are able to fit much less people in a given area. But all of that really does come at a very substantial cost to people's productivity. Another important stat, when we work in nature-inspired offices, we get a 26% boost in cognition and 30% fewer sickness-related absences. So biophilia, that's derived from a Latin word, which means the love of nature. So biophilia is all about how those nature-inspired elements, be it actual plants or anything that has a decorative or visual reference to nature itself, how those elements can actually have a very positive effect on your cognition and a very positive effect on your well-being in terms of creating quite a bit more of a comfortable environment. Now, these are results from a survey among 1,000 plus workers in the USA. They were aged 18 and older. And it shows quite clearly what I was saying earlier, in that conversational distractions really are the biggest impact on people's productivity. Interestingly enough, social media, that's sitting right at the end of the graph at 56%. A lot of people, I think myself included, would have assumed that Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and all these other social media apps are really what are draining a lot of our productivity and our attention. But you can actually see from this figure, it's quite clearly chatty co-workers. And as I said, that really is much more pronounced when you are in an open plan setting. Now, there's lots of benefits behind having good acoustics. I'm not going to list all of them, but they really do span across three broad domains. There's the mental benefit, there's the physiological benefit, and then there is the physical benefit. Interestingly enough, there was a survey that was done quite some time ago. I think it was actually done in the US, where they set up a microphone in a classroom to measure noise levels throughout the duration of the day. And they also actually attached a heart monitor to the teacher. And when they looked at the results at the end of the day, and they superimposed both graphs over on top of each other, you could see quite clearly, as the noise levels in the classroom increased, so did the heart rate of the actual teacher. So a much more noisy environment has a very negative effect on your body. It will increase your cortisol levels. It can have a negative effect on your blood pressure. Your heart rate will also increase. And it's generally a very tiresome environment to work in. That's why when we look at call centers have one of the highest staff turnover rates. They are absolutely terrible at retaining staff. And it's really not surprising at all. I was going to say I've had the benefit, but I've unfortunately had to look at quite a few call centers, and they're absolutely terrible environments to work in. You go in there, it is so noisy, it's unbelievable that people are actually able to sit in that space for 8 hours a day. Right, so now we'll look at what is sound. So how exactly do we break it down? How do we measure sound? So sound is essentially, it's a form of energy. It is a vibration that's transmitted either through a solid, a liquid, or a gas. Obviously, we experience it as sound vibrations through air, and the sound comes in a frequency range that we are able to perceive, which is about 20 to 20,000 hertz. That's the frequency range in which we are able to detect sound. As you grow older, your hearing does deteriorate, and that range does diminish slightly. But the majority of people are able to hear from about 20 to 20,000 hertz. Now, it's thanks to the millions of little air molecules that we have in the air. That's why I've got two little ping pong balls over here to demonstrate those little molecules. And these molecules are responsible for passing the vibration through a given space. Now, what happens is those sound waves eventually reach your ear. They go through your ear canal, at which point they reach your eardrum. And this is the interesting part, is the three smallest bones in your body are actually located in your middle ear. And those three small bones are responsible for carrying the vibration from your eardrum to your inner ear, where those vibrations are then converted to an electrical signal, and that electrical signal is sent to the rear part of your brain that is responsible for interpreting sound. Depending on the type of sound, if it is a very threatening sound, you'll have a different neurological response. If it's the sound of sirens or perhaps a person screaming or shouting at you, your body is going to produce adrenaline. If it's a very positive sound, perhaps someone singing your praises, then your mind and your brain is going to react very differently, and you'll produce different neurotransmitters, perhaps dopamine or serotonin. So that's really a bit of a mechanical explanation of exactly how the sound is interpreted by our ears and by our brains. And it's also important to bear in mind that sound travels incredibly quickly. So in the metric system, we would measure it as traveling about 343 meters per second. If you work in the imperial system, that would be 1,216 feet per second. So it travels incredibly fast. Now, when we look at frequency, what exactly is a frequency? How do we define it? How do we understand it? So a frequency refers to the number of vibrations that you have in a given cycle. So one cycle is measured as being 1 second long. Here you can see we have a sound wave that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vibrations. So 5 vibrations that occur in a single cycle gives you a frequency of 5 hertz. Why do we need to distinguish between the different frequencies of sound? Well, it matters because different acoustic materials absorb better or worse depending on their physical properties. So thin, less dense materials are more effective at absorbing high frequencies with a short wavelength. However, they don't really perform too well on your mid and your low frequencies. On the other hand, thicker acoustic panels with added depth and perhaps a slightly higher material density, those generally tend to give you improved absorption on your low and your mid frequencies. So if we had to group everything very loosely into 3 categories, you have your short waves, your high frequency sounds. That would be about 2,500 to 12,000 hertz. That would be things like ringtones, the consonants in the words we speak, cell phones ringing, typing keyboard, etc. Then you have the mid-length wave, and that's what we would refer to as the speech frequency range. That is probably the most important frequency range, purely because the majority of sound or noise that we are dealing with is produced by people. It's produced by people talking, and that is normally in the frequency range of about 250 to 2,500 hertz. Then right at the bottom, you have your long wave. So those are your low frequency sounds. That could be produced by anything mechanical, your HVAC, certain printers, and interestingly enough, the vowels in the words that you speak are generally at a much lower frequency. So a lot of the time when we are looking at acoustic treatment and acoustically treating a space, you have to take a very context-specific approach. Just because one product worked in one space doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in another. We need to first properly diagnose what the problem is, determine which frequencies are most problematic, and then make a decision as to which products are best suited to addressing those frequencies, and then also factor in other more practical considerations in terms of budget and actual product placement. Now, one incredibly important distinction that we always need to make, especially if you're responding to any type of acoustic issue, is to identify, is it a building acoustic issue or is it a room acoustic issue? Fortunately, this can be very easily determined, and it's just one simple question you need to ask yourself: where is the sound coming from? Is it coming from within the given room, or is it coming from outside that room? So building acoustics, there we are talking about sound transmission, sound transfer from one space to another. So that can be from outdoors to indoors, or more commonly in the office context, it can be from one enclosed room to another enclosed room. Now, building acoustics is largely a structural issue. It is a construction issue. Remember what I said earlier, the more hard and dense a material is, the better it will reflect sound. The more soft and porous it is, the better it will absorb sound. Now, in terms of building acoustics and soundproofing and reducing sound transfer between rooms, that's where you want to use materials that have a high degree of density, or that are made up with a substrate of different materials that give you good sound blocking. So if the sound is traveling from one room to another room, as I said, that's a building issue. It really relates to the type of construction materials you've used. Some of the most common issues, just to list them in no specific order. One, it could be that your wall itself is not very dense or thick. A lot of buildings, they use gypsum board. There's a reason why you have 2 layers of gypsum board with a metal stud in between and possibly some acoustic infill. That is to improve the soundproofing of that space. If you had to use a single layer of gypsum board, you would likely get much more sound that is actually passing through the wall. Another common issue is looking at the joins and the seams between the floor and the walls, and between the walls and the ceiling. If you do not have a very clean seal, if you do not have an airtight seal, generally that can be a cause for sound transfer between spaces. Sound is very much like water. It will take the path of least resistance. So if you have a fish tank that's filled with water, it doesn't matter how thick the glass walls are. If you have a crack or a gap somewhere, the water will seep out. It's exactly the same with sound. A lot of people invest a lot of money in erecting partitions or walls that have a very high STC rating. They do their due diligence. They speak to the manufacturers or the suppliers, and they say, does this wall have a high STC rating, which is your sound transmission class? Yes, it does. They think they check the box, but they don't take into consideration the other structural aspects of that room. Another very common issue is sound transfer through the ceiling void. So if you have an office space where you have a dropped ceiling grid with acoustic ceiling tiles in there, obviously that's very convenient and useful if you've got services that are traveling through the ceiling void between rooms. But a lot of the time what happens is, even if you've got a wall that's got very good sound blocking with a high STC rating, you can have sound transfer through the ceiling void. So that is where sound waves will be passing through the acoustic ceiling grid, through the acoustic tiles, traveling through the ceiling void, and then down into the adjacent room. So when you've got an issue with soundproofing, you need to check the walls, you need to check the joins between the walls and the floor, you need to check the ceiling in terms of what type of ceiling tile you have. There's a very common metric, it's called the CAC, which stands for Ceiling Attenuation Class. Now that is the ceiling tiles version of the STC. So remember, STC stands for Sound Transmission Class. That is a measure of how well and how effectively a wall blocks sound. And your CAC, which is your Ceiling Attenuation Class, that is a measure of how effectively a ceiling blocks sound. When we look at room acoustics, that's where absorption really comes into play. So I should probably highlight at this point, if you've got issues with sound transfer from one room to another room, putting acoustic products in one or both rooms is not necessarily going to resolve the issue. If one of those rooms is highly reverberant and there's a lot of reflective materials, then that reverberated sound will be increasing the noise levels. In that instance, if you put acoustic products into that space and you absorb some of that reverberated sound, you will be able to achieve a reduction in noise levels, but that will not necessarily resolve your issue of sound transmission from one room to another. When we are dealing with room acoustics, we are looking at the sound that is produced in that given room, and we are looking at implementing solutions in there to reduce the sound reflections, to reduce noise levels, and to improve call quality, and just to provide a much more comfortable listening environment. So just to highlight the distinction between the two, on the left, we've got building acoustics. There you're looking at soundproofing. You're trying to soundproof to reduce sound transmission between spaces. You do that by using insulating materials that have high density. That is a structural consideration, as in it goes into the construction and how the room has actually been put together in terms of the architecture, and that you measure in decibels. So you measure the sound reduction in volume between those two spaces in decibels. Room acoustics, on the other hand, there you are looking at internal room treatment. You are looking to reduce the reverberation. You do that by introducing sound absorbent elements in order to determine the correct amount of products to put in the space and which products you should be using. You need to look at the room specifications. Hence me saying earlier, you need to take a very context-specific approach. Before you can even start considering or talking about solutions, you first need to get a handle on exactly what the problem is, what is the cause of it, what are the different factors at play, and how best do we address that. And then just lastly, when we're looking at reverberation and absorption, we are looking at hertz. So remember, once again, we are looking at the different frequencies and trying to determine which ones are most problematic. All right. Now we're going to get to the acoustic data and tools. So this is the real nitty-gritty part. For those of you that are specifiers, this is very important. Not all acoustic products are the same. They do not all have the same performance. And so you really need to properly understand how are acoustic products tested, how is that information conveyed, how do you interpret that information. Only once you are able to do that can you actually have a very accurate comparison between different products. Now, NRC, that is probably a figure that some of you should be familiar with. It stands for noise reduction coefficient. That's a scalable figure, so it goes between 0 and 1. 0 is 0%, 1 equates to 100%. Depending on where your NRC value falls between 0 and 1, it'll also be ascribed a different class, be it A, B, or C. And NRC, these values, and this is absolutely really important, are only for fixed wall and ceiling solutions. This is a point of substantial confusion at the moment in the market. Now, if we look at how an NRC is calculated, the NRC is determined by looking at the absorption coefficient graph. So on the x-axis at the bottom over there, you have your frequencies. You've got your low frequencies on the left, mid, and then your high frequencies to the right. And on the y-axis over there, that is your measure of absorption as a percentage. That's why the top value on the y-axis is 1. Okay. Now, if you look at the dots that we have over here at the 0.5 mark, basically what this graph is indicating to us is it is saying that this particular acoustic product will absorb 50% of the sound waves at 250 hertz. If we look at the higher frequencies, this graph is telling us that from 500 hertz all the way up to 4,000 hertz, sound waves in that frequency range will be absorbed 100% by this particular product. Now, these figures are used to determine the NRC. And the way you do that is you take the absorption value at 250, 500, 1,000, and 2,000. You add those four values together and you divide by 4. So your NRC is essentially an average of your absorption across these 4 frequencies. It's a very useful and a handy figure if you're looking between different products and you want a quick comparison. The NRC is a very quick and easy way to see what the performance is, but you must be aware that it is purely an average. It is not giving you accurate information as to exactly which frequencies the product works best at. That's why you need to take a look at the absorption coefficient graph. Aside from the NRC, you have another value which is called the alpha Sabin. That's just above the NRC, and that is calculated in the same way that an NRC is, except it is calculated across a broader frequency range. So instead of just adding the values at 250, 500, 1,000, and 2,000, you add the values at 125, 250, 500, 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000, and then you divide by 6. So your alpha Sabin is actually a more accurate figure because your alpha Sabin is an average across the broader frequency range. The reason they've done that is the NRC is quite an old figure. It was first arrived in the 1950s. Back in the 1950s, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have printers, they didn't have computers. So we didn't have phones ringing, we didn't have keyboards being typing, we didn't have printers going, we also didn't have the same air conditioning systems. So back in the 1950s, you didn't really have very many sounds that were at the very low and very high end of the frequency spectrum. Now, in the modern era, if you go into the office space, you're going to hear a lot more sounds. Some of those sounds are going to be very low frequencies. Some of them are going to be higher frequencies. That is why they have said we need a new metric, which is the alpha Sabin, because we now need to take into consideration absorption across a much broader frequency range. When it comes to the acoustic results of a product, your products can never be tested or never should be tested by the manufacturer or by the dealer. That would be a conflict of interest. So when your products are tested for their acoustic performance, they should be tested by a third-party independent laboratory. That's what you can see in front of you over here. We use a company called Puits that are based in Belgium. They have a reverberation chamber. That's basically a space where they know exactly, very accurately, what the acoustic properties of that room is. And that means when they introduce any new objects into that room and they remeasure again, they are able to very accurately determine what effect those particular objects that you've introduced into the room are having. So this is more or less what their test report looks like. They sign it off, approving it for publication. Once they do that, we then take this graph and we convert it into something like this that's a little bit more easily understood. So these test results are really what make up the substance behind an acoustic product's claims regarding performance. It's these test results that really provide credibility. So if you want to know whether a product has been acoustically tested, you need to ask for these reports. Like I said, nowadays, the term acoustic is being bandied around a lot. People are saying this is acoustic, that's acoustic. Yes, technically everything is acoustic, but if you really want to know how well it performs and you really want to be sure that it's the correct product, you need to make sure that it has actually been tested. As I said before, your NRC value, depending on where it falls, from 0 to 1, it'll be ascribed a different absorption class. So a product with an NRC of 0.9 or above is a Class A product. So if people say this is a Class A product or this is a Class B acoustic product, they are simply referring to the NRC value, more or less where that value falls in terms of a percentage rating. Right. This is the point at which things get a little bit more complicated and confusing. Now, when we measure things, we have a unit of measurement for absolutely everything. We measure time in seconds, minutes, hours, and days. We measure distance in meters or feet or miles or kilometers. So you need to have a unit of measurement for sound as well. And it's the purpose of that unit of measurement is really to quantify. We need to quantify the amount of absorption that's being provided by a particular object or product. And that's what a Sabin is. A Sabin is your unit of measurement that we use to quantify the amount of absorption that something is giving you. Now, you can have an imperial Sabin and you can have a metric Sabin. An imperial Sabin is measured in square feet. A metric Sabin is measured in square meters. So just to give you an example, if you had a window in a room and that window was open and that window was 1 square meter in size, that window would be providing you 1 metric Sabin. The reason being is that 1 square meter window is providing you 100% absorption. It's providing you 100% absorption because any of the sound waves that reach that window are not going to be reflected back in. They're going to escape out of the room. If you have a window that is 1 square foot, that is giving you 1 imperial Sabin. Very important to make this distinction. The majority of facts and figures out there are measured in metric Sabins, but it's important to make that distinction. You don't want to make the mistake where you're looking at 1 Sabin graph for a product and another Sabin graph for another product, and the one graph is in metric Sabins and the other graph is in imperial Sabins. Obviously, you cannot do a like-for-like comparison. Also very important, as Sabin is the only means by which we can measure the acoustic performance of geometric or 3D objects. This is a very, very important point to make. So just to reiterate this now, and this is a distinction that creates a lot of confusion in the industry. We get a lot of specifiers, architects and interior designers that contact us and they say, what is the NRC value for this product? And we cannot give them an NRC value for the product. And the reason we cannot give them an NRC value is because it doesn't have one. And the reason it doesn't have one is because it doesn't have an absorption coefficient graph. And the reason it doesn't have an absorption coefficient graph, which is what you use to determine the NRC, the reason it doesn't have that graph is because it is tested in an entirely different manner. So remember, when they test these objects in the reverberation room, they use a number of calculations and algorithms. Those calculations and algorithms determine the result. Those calculations and algorithms also determine how that result is conveyed. So over here, you can see we've got a three-dimensional object. So what I mean by that three-dimensional, technically everything is three-dimensional, but it's an object where you've got exposure on more than one side. So it's very easy to see. This is our partitioning screening solution. There's a front side and there's a back side. Both sides of the screen are absorbing sound. Now, if we go back to the other graph that I showed you, this is for a wall-mounted element. That is why the product is being laid flat on the ground. It doesn't matter whether they lay it on the ground or whether they lay it on the wall, the functionality is still the same. This is what we would refer to as a two-dimensional object. Obviously, it is three-dimensional, but we mean two-dimensional in the sense that it only has one exposed surface. Okay, the moment it only has one exposed surface, it is tested in this manner, and it results in an absorption coefficient graph. The moment you've got a three-dimensional object like this, and it's not just freestanding elements, it is also ceiling suspended elements, elements that you have cables suspended from the ceiling. Those objects also have open exposure to the air on the underside and the top side, so that we would define those as three-dimensional objects. Now you'll notice this graph is quite different. The y-axis, on the y-axis, the values exceed 1. That is the first way in which you know you are not looking at absorption, an absorption coefficient graph. Now, just to try and explain this a little bit more simply, here we've actually got exactly the same product. Okay, there you can see it mounted flush against the wall. The moment it is mounted flush against the wall, it is a 2D product, as in it only has one exposed surface. That means it gets tested in a manner that produces an absorption coefficient graph. You know it's an absorption coefficient graph because the value on the y-axis, the highest value is 1, and this absorption coefficient graph gives us the NRC. If we take that same element and we cable suspend it from the ceiling, now it is a three-dimensional object because it is not just absorbing sound on the front side, it is also absorbing sound on the back of the panel. Because remember, sound waves that aren't directly impacting on this panel, sound waves that are going past and perhaps hitting the ceiling, may rebound and actually get absorbed by the back of the product. Okay, so the moment it is suspended or it's freestanding, it's tested in a different manner. They use different calculations, and that results in a different graph. Now, to kind of delineate and explain the difference between these two graphs, because they're actually telling you two very different things. The graph on the left, the absorption coefficient graph, that is a measure of how well or how effectively a product absorbs sound. And the reason I say that is because on the y-axis, it's a measure in percentages. 1 is the highest value, and that's because 1 relates to 100%. So this graph on the left is not really telling us how much absorption is being provided. It's not really quantifying for us the actual amount of absorption. It is just telling us how effectively and how efficiently this product actually absorbs that sound as a measure from 0 to 1%. When we look at the graph on the right, that is not a measure of performance as a percentage. The graph on the right is actually telling us the amount of absorption that's being provided as a quantity. So remember, as I said earlier, your unit of measurement for sound absorption is a Sabin. 1 Sabin is the equivalent of 1 square meter of 100% absorption. So what this graph is telling us on the right, if you look at the top line, which is for the Edel large, you'll notice at about 500 hertz, it is pegged at 1.8. So what it is telling you is this product, the Edel large, is providing you 1.8 Sabins of absorption at 500 hertz. Okay, so that's essentially the distinction between the two. You cannot make a comparison between the two of them. Now, the moment you have something that is ceiling suspended or something that is freestanding, the manner in which it's tested gives you this graph, and you cannot use this graph to determine an NRC value. And therefore, this product does not have an NRC value. The best way to measure the performance of a product is to look at the amount of Sabins that it is providing. How much is it actually contributing? And part of the reason for that is when we do an acoustic assessment of a space, we take into account all the structural finishes, and then we calculate how many Sabins are required in order to address the acoustics in this room. So once we've calculated the reverberation time, and we know that we want to get the reverberation down to a certain range, we can then determine, okay, in order to get that outcome, we need to have 6 Sabins of absorption on 500 hertz, and we need to have 8 Sabins of absorption on 2000 hertz. Once we know that, we can then go and look at our products and see, okay, we need 6 and we need 8. I'll use 2 of this, I'll use 1 of that, and I'll use 1 of that. And that'll make up the amount of Sabins that we need. Now, if you're not confused already, just to confuse things even more, the graph on the left, which is your absorption coefficient graph, you can convert the graph on the left to a graph on the right. You can determine how many Sabins a product is providing you by taking the absorption coefficient graph and timesing it by the surface area of the product. So you can move from left to right, but you cannot move from right to left. And the reason I keep reiterating this is I'm hoping that I'm explaining it well enough as to why certain products do not have an NRC value. So if you are going to do a comparison between 2 different products, don't do a comparison between these 2 graphs. Instead, look at the Sabin value of the 2 different products. So like I said, the only way you can make this comparison is to take this graph over here and times it by the surface area of the product, and that'll tell you how many Sabins you're getting from that particular product. And then once you've got that, you know how many Sabins you've got from this product, you know how many you've got from that one, then you can do a comparison in terms of their performance. Okay, decibels. This is not really something that we measure too frequently. It's a measure of loudness. It's a measure of perceived volume. What a lot of people don't realize is that decibels are measured on a logarithmic scale. What that means is an increase of 10 decibels is perceived by the human ear as a doubling of sound, and a decrease of 10 decibels is perceived as a halving of sound. So if you have a sound source, let's say you're listening to the radio in the car and you turn the volume up twice as loud, you're actually just increasing the volume by 10 decibels. Now, here we have the recommended background noise level in an office as 40 decibels. That's very ambitious. A lot of other companies would say it should be closer to around 48 decibels. As with most things, there isn't really general consensus. Everyone has their own opinion. But what I would share with you is that you do not want your office space to be too quiet. The moment your office space is too quiet, like a library, that's the moment you can hear a pin drop on the other side of the room. That is the moment you have issues with speech privacy. If your office is too quiet and Nancy is having a conversation 20 meters away, you're going to be able to hear her. So you do want a little bit of background noise. You want a little bit of background noise to be able to provide some sound masking so you don't hear absolutely all the conversations that are going on. And you want a little bit of background noise to provide stimulation. Just like light keeps us awake and alert and stimulates us, sound does exactly the same thing. If you have a little bit of background noise, a little bit of a buzz in the office, it keeps people alert and awake. But it's really about reaching and aiming for that sweet zone. You don't want it too quiet, but at the same time, you don't want it too noisy. If it's too noisy, it becomes a stressful environment. You have issues in terms of call quality because people can't hear what you're saying because of all the people around you. And then you have another whole host of other issues. So I would recommend the ideal reverberation time, or sorry, the ideal decibel volume level in an office space should be around 50 decibels. Like I said, that's very ambitious. 95% of offices will not achieve that. The majority of offices, particularly open plan settings, are generally from about 50 to 65 decibels. The moment you go over 70 decibels, that is when you have a definite issue. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. And it's mostly only call centers that really have those elevated noise levels in the space. A lot of them like to use sound masking. That's not really something I'm going to talk too much upon, but it takes an entirely different approach to the problem. So with sound masking, all you're doing is it's an additive approach. So you've got a whole load of noise in the space. Instead of trying to soak up and absorb that sound, which is what we're trying to do, you are instead just overlaying even more white noise on top of it. So white noise and sound masking does not reduce noise levels. All it does is it reduces speech intelligibility. Now remember, speech intelligibility is a measure of how clearly you can make out what is being said. So if you're in a call center, a lot of the time the main issue they have is when the operators are on the phone, the clients or the customers on the other end of the line can't hear what the operator is saying clearly, and the reason they can't hear it is because they're hearing all the other operators talking in the background. So what they often do is they turn on a sound masking system in there. That sound masking pumps out white noise. Think about the static that you would normally get on your TV. White noise is the auditory version of that static. It's just a whole load of static sound. Now they pump that sound into the space, and what that does is it reduces the degree to which you are actually able to make out the words of what other people are saying. So then what happens is the clients or the customers on the other end of the line, they can hear their operator much more clearly because the white noise is blocking out all the background and the surrounding conversations. That's great for them. It's absolutely terrible for the operator because the operator is still sat in a room where now there's not only a whole load of people conversing and chatting, but now they've got even more noise that's actually pumping through the ceiling. So it's, like I said, it's an entirely different approach. With absorption, you're taking a subtractive approach. You're trying to reduce the amount of acoustic energy in the space. With sound masking or white noise, you're not trying to reduce it. You're just pumping in a whole load of extra noise to try and cover up that other noise. You get two different types of sound masking systems. You get an active and a passive system. A passive system is where the output is just set at one constant decibel level. The active system is a much better one. The active system will generally incorporate some microphones, and what the active system does is it increases and decreases the output of white noise based on how noisy the space actually is. So white noise in sound masking is generally sometimes necessary in a call center, but I really wouldn't advise that you use it in any other office context. But really that is partially down to personal preference, and a lot of time there are other practical factors that you need to take into consideration that might suggest that that would be the better way to go. All right, so reverberation, that is the main thing that we are trying to reduce. Now, how do we measure reverberation? Reverberation is measured in seconds. So your reverberation time is the time for an original sound source to decay by 60 decibels. So normally I use the analogy of a balloon, but I'll use the analogy of a gun this time. If you were sat in a room, or you're standing in a room and you fired off a gun, let's say the initial bang of that gun was 100 decibels in volume, okay? So you've got that initial sound burst. You would then measure how long it takes for those sound waves to drop in volume by 60 decibels. The more reflective your room is, the longer those sound waves will bounce around, because remember, they're not being absorbed, they're being reflected. So the more reflective your room is, the longer those sound waves will bounce around, the longer your reverberation time will be. Now, it's important to remember that sound travels in a straight line. It doesn't bend or it doesn't curve. It travels in a straight line, but at the same time, it travels in absolutely every direction. So it's omnidirectional. If you think about it, when you are blowing up a balloon and the balloon is expanding outwards, the same thing is happening with your sound waves. Yes, they're traveling in a straight line, but they're also traveling in absolutely every single direction. Now, when we look at the influences on reverberation time, the main thing is the volume of the room, the volumetric size of a room. As a room gets bigger and bigger in size, the distances between the walls and the other surfaces are longer and longer, you can expect a longer reverberation time. Room temperature, that's another factor as well, although the impact is largely marginal, so that's not really something you need to account for. And then lastly, but also very importantly, the absorption coefficient of materials, objects, and peoples in a room. So as I said, everything has acoustic properties. And having a low or a good reverberation time at its core is really just simply a balancing act. It's about the amount of hard and reflective surfaces you've got in a room and the amount of soft, absorbent materials or surfaces that you've got in a room. If you've got a lot of reflective materials, you're going to have a long reverberation time. If you've got a lot of absorbative materials, you're going to have a low reverberation time. Having a good reverberation time is about having a good balance between those two things. The bigger a room is, the more reflective materials it has in that room, the more absorbative materials you're going to need to balance it out. So you will need more absorption in a larger room, and you will need less absorption in a smaller room if all things were the same. Now, we don't have one set ideal reverberation time. And as I said, that's because it depends on the volumetric size of a room. So you can see for call centers or an open office, we would recommend between 0.4 and 0.9 seconds. If you have a very small call center, you want to have a lower reverberation time of 0.4. If you've got a much larger center in size, then you can make do with a longer reverberation time without it having an impact on the performance of sound in the space. You also need to take into consideration the function of that given room. So you'll see the other day we did a presentation. I was actually asked a very good question by one of the attendees, which caught me a bit off guard, but it was an excellent question. They were saying, why is the general office 0.4 to 0.6 seconds, but the private office can be 0.6 to 0.8? And that was actually a very good distinction to make. And my answer to him was simply that a private office would be for a single person. So there you've got one person, one source of sound. You're going to have less noise in that space. So therefore you can have a slightly longer reverberation time. General office would imply multiple people, more people in the space. More people in the space, more people talking, more acoustic energy means you should aim for a lower reverberation time. All right. So a lot of what I've been doing is explaining these things theoretically to you guys from a conceptual basis. It's very easy for people to understand. It's another thing to actually practically experience it. So that's what we're going to try and show you guys right now. This is a built-up model of an actual space in the US. It had absolutely terrible acoustics. We decided to do a bit of a case study of it. So we built up a model of the space. What we did is we measured the reverberation time before we put anything in, and then we started to incrementally add more and more items into the space and watch how the acoustics improved. And then we also did recordings in the room after we added more and more items. And this really comes back to what I was saying before, that everything is scalable. Okay, you've got terrible acoustics, bad, okay, good, and excellent. Everything is going to fall on that scale. But the one important thing to bear in mind is that when it comes to acoustics, you are dealing with the law of diminishing returns. So what that means is, if you want to get the reverberation time lower and lower and lower, you have to start adding exponentially more and more and more products. So you might get 80% of the desired outcome using only 60% of the products. But if you want to get 100%, you're going to have to use an extra 40%. So as I said, as you want to improve it more and more, you have to start adding exponentially more products. So that's why it really needs to be a consideration of multiple different factors. But I'll touch on that a little bit later. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you a sound source now. If your speakers, please make sure your speakers are turned up so you can hear. This is going to be an audio clip of what it sounded like in the room before any treatment was added.
BuzzySpace products combine aesthetics and noise reduction, responding to the global need to bring acoustic control and style to the workplace. BuzzySpace products are...
All right, so you would have heard it's a bit reverberant. You can hear there's quite a bit of echo, and that reduces the speech intelligibility and the speech clarity, how clearly we can actually make out what was being said. This graph in front of you is what the reverberation time was in that room before. Okay, so when you're looking at this, what it's telling you is sound waves at a 4,000 hertz frequency will reverberate in this space for 1.79 seconds before decaying. So if you have a sound in that room at 4,000 hertz, those sound waves are going to bounce around for 1.8 seconds before they dissipate entirely. So what we want to do is there's two things we want to do. We need to get these reverberation times beneath the upper grayed out line, because those two lines represent the ideal reverberation time for a venue of this size. So we need to get those values on that curve beneath the upper line. And at the same time, we actually want to flatten the curve. And the reason being is that is going to give you a much more acoustically balanced space. So if we look at the same space again now, after we have added a couple of elements, there's some screening and some soft seating over there. I'll just play for you what it sounds like after we put that in.
BuzzySpace products combine aesthetics and noise reduction, responding to the global need to bring acoustic control and style to the workplace.
Still a bit echoic, but much better. And that was reflected in the results. So the second line we have over here, that's the acoustic improvement that was achieved after we added the products into the space. You can see it substantially lowered it. It's also flattened the curve, but it wasn't quite enough in terms of getting it to that ideal range. So then we went and added some additional items, some overhead cable suspended solutions, if you can see in front of you over there. And this really represented the ideal specification for the space. So what I'm going to do is just go back quickly to the original sound source, play that for you again when there was no acoustic treatment, and then I'll play you the last one after we put everything into the space.
BuzzySpace products combine aesthetics and noise reduction, responding to the global need to bring acoustic control and style to the workplace. BuzzySpace products are made from recycled... BuzzySpace products combine aesthetics and noise reduction, responding to the global need to bring acoustic control and style to the workplace. BuzzySpace products...
Right, so you want to notice two things. One, the reverberation, the echo was removed. That lowered the noise level, and it really actually improved the speech intelligibility, how clearly we could actually make out what was being said. And that was also reflected in the results. You can see that we managed to flatten the curve, and we managed to get all the values beneath the upper line. And in doing so, we've really managed to provide ideal acoustics for the space. All right, I've just noticed we're about 5 minutes over time. We're almost at the end of the presentation. I'm just going to shoot through these last sections relatively quickly. How do we tackle reverberation? There's three acoustic principles: absorption, attenuation, and diffusion. The main one we use is absorption. The laws of thermodynamics state that you cannot create or destroy energy. You can't create energy out of nothing, and you can't destroy it. You can only convert it, and you can only transmute it. And that is what we're doing with absorption. We are taking that acoustic sound energy. Once it impacts with the product, it actually permeates the panel itself, and it causes all the small fibers that we have inside that particle to vibrate. And that vibration is our conversion from acoustic sound energy to kinetic heat energy. Kinetic as in the fibers themselves actually move, and heat is the result of that movement and the friction between those different fibers. So that's essentially what we're doing with absorption. Any soft and porous materials are going to give you a good absorption. So drapery, acoustic wallpaper, acoustic pillars, seating elements. The more thick and larger an acoustic product is, generally the better absorption it's going to give you. You also have attenuation. So that's the energy loss of sound propagation. So that reduces sound transfer within a given room. This is not the same as building acoustics. There we were talking about sound transmission from one enclosed space to another. Here we're talking about reducing sound transmission in a given room. One of the best ways to demonstrate that is with an acoustic screen. So you erect that screening solution. Part of the sound is absorbed, but some of the sound is able to make its way through. How little of the sound is able to make its way through is a measure of the sound attenuation properties of that particular object. Some of the best attenuators you can get out of there, a desk divider. Now, this is really something I'd take the time, if I could, just talk about 10 or 15 minutes on it, but we don't have time for that now. But desk-based screens, acoustic desk-based screens are some of the smartest solutions. When you're looking, as I mentioned earlier, at where you're going to place your absorption, generally you want your absorption as close as possible to the source of the sound. People themselves are the source of the sound. You're not going to get your absorber any closer to a person than to have it on their desk. Now, it's important to remember that your desk-based screen serves multiple functions. One, it gives you visual privacy, so that blocks out some of the visual distractions around you and gives you ownership of your own space. It gives you acoustic privacy, as in sheltering you a little bit, giving you improved speech privacy because it's absorbing more of your sound, and it acts as a physical barrier. And that last one is probably a little bit more important now with the whole COVID situation. We need to look at ways in which we can really implement the physical distancing in a space. Acoustic desk-based screens are a fantastic idea, but they do need to be a certain height. We would ideally say at least 45 centimeters from tabletop. At some point, I did know what that was in inches. It's too late in the evening, so I can't remember now. But if you jot it down, 45 centimeters, that's more or less the height at which you've got adequate coverage, but a person is still able to peer over the top of the screen if they need to make eye contact or communicate with anyone. The other solutions that we have, freestanding room dividers, suspended room dividers, and then acoustic seating. Just quickly before we move on, acoustic furniture is a fantastic solution in any open plan setting. Part of the thinking behind it is that you need to take your conversational distractions and you need to displace them to another area. That's why you have in the whole activity-based working methodology, you have your breakaway areas, your informal meeting areas, your collaboration areas. The whole idea is that you have those conversations and you take them and you displace them to another area and you try and contain those conversations as much as possible to reduce distractions to the other people around you. That is the thinking behind acoustic furniture. It's a dual function item. It provides people a functional workspace, whether it's more formal with a tabletop or less formal, perhaps a little informal without a tabletop. As long as it has a lot of acoustic material, you can imagine these seating elements over here. If people are sat inside them and they're having a conversation, a lot of the sound is being absorbed by the shields that they have around them. Diffusion, this is not too important. One, it has a very lesser effect, but it's basically the efficacy by which sound energy is spread evenly in a given space. So just to give you guys a simple example, your sound waves will always reflect at the same angle of incidence that they hit an object. So if you have a sound wave coming straight on, it's going to reflect off. If you have a sound wave coming at a 30-degree angle, it's going to reflect at a 30-degree angle. So if you have a surface that is multifaceted and that is angled and that isn't perfectly flat, what happens is the sound waves actually get scattered in multiple directions, or more specifically, they get diffused in multiple directions, and that produces the acoustic energy. So any objects that aren't perfectly flat will give you good sound diffusion. Just lastly, before we hit the last final section, the holy trinity of acoustic products: density, size, and shape. So the density of the material you use, generally slightly more dense material, is better at absorbing low and mid frequencies. If the material becomes too dense, then it becomes reflective. Your less dense materials are generally slightly better at absorbing on the higher frequencies, but you also need to take into consideration the thickness of a product. The thicker a product is, the more acoustic material you have, the better performance you're going to get out of it, particularly on the low and the mid frequencies. Size, that's a no-brainer. The larger your product is, the more acoustic material you have, the more absorption you can expect from it. And then shape, that ties into what I said earlier in terms of diffusion. Interestingly enough, this product was designed that way purely as an aesthetic consideration, but in actual fact, the way in which the material has been pleated and folded and overlapped actually results in an incredibly good acoustic performance, even though the material is very thin, because we've overlapped it and because there's certain air gaps that really actually boost the performance. And then you've got the added diffusion that comes from the object not being perfectly flat. Right, so that leads us to our last section. I'm always hesitant to give you guys this information because I've just spoken for about an hour now on how we need to take such a context-specific approach and first calculate what the issue is in a space before actually looking at the acoustic treatment. Just as a rule of thumb, in case you guys just need a quick estimation, how much acoustic material do I bring into a room? If it is a room where the walls are reflective, the floor and the ceiling are all reflective, a very quick estimation you can do is you can take the total wall surface area, cover 25% of that wall surface area with an acoustic product that has an NRC of 0.7 or greater. If you have a room that has an acoustic ceiling grid, the floor is reflective and the walls are reflective, so that would be any space where you haven't got a carpeted floor, there you should aim to cover 15% of the wall surface area with acoustic material. If you've got a room that has got an acoustic ceiling grid and a carpeted floor, there you probably would only need to cover around 10% of the exposed wall surface area. As I said earlier, the best positioning of acoustic product will be as close as possible to the source of the sound. The closer it is to the source of the sound, the more of that acoustic energy you are able to absorb before it is able to propagate and spread throughout a room. So consider how you can get elements in close proximity to people, and also consider the transmission and signal path of sound in a space. Where is the sound traveling from? How do we interrupt it along its path to try and reduce sound transmission? As I said before, acoustic furniture is fantastic in terms of containing that. Also consider acoustic lighting. Your lighting needs to be in close proximity to people so they have adequate lux levels on their tabletop. And your acoustics and your sound absorption needs to be in close proximity to people so it absorbs a larger amount of their sound. For that reason, acoustic lighting makes a lot of sense. Why have two different solutions when you can really solve both problems with a single product? So we'd really recommend that you guys consider that. Meeting rooms, it's always good to have some kind of a suspended element over the tabletop, especially if you've got a reflective ceiling, but then also try and make a point of spacing your absorption evenly throughout a given space. Just lastly, just to reiterate everything, it's very important that you take a calculated approach to things. So there is an application that's free to download off the Apple Store. So it's available on iPhones or on an iPad. It's called the Buzzy Space RT60. It's free to download. It's an application that you can use to measure the reverberation time in a space. It also has a drop-down menu and catalog of products. Once you've measured the space, it will give you a graph telling you what the reverberation time is. It will have one line on that graph. Then you can actually add products into the space, and it'll generate a secondary line on that graph, which will give you an indication of whether you need to add more or less products in a specific space. If you can't test it, you can always reach out to us. There's certain information that we need in a space. Ideally, if you can take a video from the center of the room in a 360-degree pan. If you do that, we're able to identify all the structural finishes. We're also able to see how much available space there is on the walls and the ceiling. And that allows us to do a calculation, a theoretical calculation on the required amount of absorption. As I said before, it's very important if you want to guarantee an outcome, or at least be certain that you're proposing the correct solution, you really need to first get to grips with the problem. Last thing to remember, and I always put this slide in here because this is probably one of the more valuable insights I can offer all of you guys, especially as specifiers. The entire focus of this presentation has been largely acoustic based. Obviously, in real life, in practical application, things are never that simple. So if you are looking at an acoustic solution for a space, it's really a compromise between three things. You've got your price, the cost of that element, how does it fit into the budget? You've got the performance, how bad are the acoustics? How important is it that we address the acoustics in the space? And then you have aesthetics. How do the products look? How important are the decorative aspects? And it's very important when you're consulting with clients about an acoustic solution that you establish what is the hierarchy of priorities. What comes first? Is it performance? Does the space sound terrible? Is it of utmost importance that we address the acoustics? Is it severely budget constrained? You've only got $5,000 or $10,000, cannot exceed that. We need to find a solution that fits within the budget. Perhaps it's a hospitality setting. It's a reception area. It's a client-facing space. The decorative and aesthetic aspects are really important, and the acoustics is of secondary benefit. You can't have all three of those things as a priority. So you need to first address which is the most important thing. Are we going to primarily focus on aesthetics? Are we going to focus on performance? Or are we constrained by a budget? Once you have that hierarchy laid out, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to determine what is the correct acoustic treatment. Are we going to go for low cost? Are we going to go for something that's very decorative? Or are we going to go for something that really gives the best performance? All right, so that pretty much concludes things from my side. Hashtag acoustics are fun, or at least I like to say so. We're always within reach, so if you guys do need any advice, you can reach us on this email address. And I do see there are, I think, a couple of questions.
Yep, I will. Thank you, Richard. I'll read out. We did get a couple of questions. So the first question we got here, which you sort of came at the beginning, near the beginning, and you sort of addressed it as we went on, which is younger generations like to collaborate while working. So how do we design productive workspace with sound barriers to prevent distractions, but also space that people still have to be in?
Well, it's a very good question. And like I said, I wish I could give you one answer that would work in absolutely every single space. But with most things, it's really about arriving at a compromise. So as I said, the purpose of having those collaboration spaces and the whole idea behind the activity-based ways of working is that you need to try and implement what we would refer to as an acoustical zoning plan. So that's basically where you just accept right from the get-go that you are not going to be able to have perfect acoustics in your entire office space. It's not going to be practical in terms of erecting partitions and barriers everywhere. It's not going to be financially feasible in terms of the cost of putting all those items in there. And if you had to acoustically treat an entire office space, you probably wouldn't end up with the look and feel that you're aiming for in terms of decor and the aesthetics. So that's why with the acoustical zoning plan, you simply accept, okay, certain areas are going to be noisy and other areas we need to be less noisy. And sometimes the way in which you need to do that is you actually need to distinguish between the different types of jobs that people do. Some people, sales is perhaps on the phone more. Accounting and finance, they're not on the phone a lot. They do concentrative, focused work. Don't put those people together. Don't put them in close proximity. That's why you divide things in terms of different teams. To make things even more complicated and add another potential layer, you need to take into account whether people are introverted or extroverted. And that really relates to what your base level of arousal is. So an extroverted person, they need more stimulation from their environment in order to be engaged and focused. So an extroverted person wants to be in a slightly more busy space where there's more conversation, where there's people walking fast, there's lots going on. Their brain feeds off all that stimulation, and it actually helps them stay engaged and satisfied with their task. If you put an introverted person next to that guy, they are not going to be able to work because there's too much noise for them, there's too much activity, and they can't focus on the task at hand. So as I said, the acoustic zoning plan, there you really try and say, okay, the open plan, particularly if people are going to be doing focus work, we don't want there to be conversational distractions. So what you do is you try and displace that to another area. You give people collaboration zones. You could give them acoustic phone booths. So if they need to make a phone call, they can pop into a phone booth. You also get some acoustic booths that are slightly larger for 2 to 4 people. Those are a great alternative to meeting rooms because a lot of meeting rooms end up being empty for the majority of the day, or the meeting rooms are actually only being used by 1 or 2 people. So an acoustic phone booth is a very space efficient and intelligent solution because it's actually much more mobile and flexible in terms of how you move things around. But that's really the main approach you can take, in terms of just trying to displace those conversations. And then, like I said, other small interventions. Make sure, if you can, that you have an acoustic ceiling grid, particularly in the open plan. Make sure the floor is carpeted. That's also going to help. Have a good acoustic desk-based screen. And then the last thing, and I think a lot of people overlook this, but this is really important. It comes down to company culture, and it's a matter of etiquette. As the employer or as the designer and the architect or any specifier, you're responsible for providing a project and putting in good solutions. But at the end of the day, you cannot overlook the responsibility of the people who are in that space to be accountable to themselves and each other. So as in, you have a set work etiquette. Do not distract your colleagues around you. If you need to have a conversation, go and have your conversation over there, or go and have your conversation over there. Or if you have a phone call, take your phone calls in the phone booth or take it over there. It's a matter of etiquette in terms of instructing people how they need to go about their business in the office space that is considerate and respectful to the other people that they have around them.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. And the last question is, do you have a PDF version of this presentation that could be shared?
Oh, now then, I'd have to check with the marketing department. Generally, they prefer that we don't share the presentation, but what I might be able to do is I could potentially share a recording of the presentation itself. So you wouldn't have a PDF of the presentation, but you would have a recording of it. It is a common request that we get, but the marketing department has asked that we do not readily share this information, just in case, because it is a CEU and it's an accredited presentation. But if anyone does want a recording of it, my email address is right here at the end. You can just pop me an email at acoustics.care@buzzyspace. Just cite this particular session, and I'll be happy to send you a link with the recording of the actual presentation. Well, actually, Nolan, now that I think about it, you're the host of the Zoom session, so you're the one who would have the recording, not me.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. We are recording the presentation, and it'll be available for anybody who requests it. So we're not going to post it publicly, but if someone on this presentation in the group would like a copy of it to view it, we'll have it available after 24 hours for people. If any further questions for anybody? Nope. Okay. Then thank you everyone for attending. Our next presentation is scheduled for November 26th. It is titled The New Office Mandate, and we'll be focusing on what the experts are saying about how social environments will play an even more important role as we return to the office. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Richard, for presenting that fantastic presentation. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks
Thank
all.
you, Nolan. Cheers.